France's new president-elect, Emmanuel Macron, says he has a mandate to reform the country, as he puts it. 5 years ago, François Hollande, the then new president, said exactly the same thing. He crashed and burned quite spectacularly. He finished up with an approval rating of 4%. He was the first president in the history of the Fifth Republic not to re-stand for office. He was so hated. His party chose a rebel who'd consistently opposed him to be the candidate standing to replace him. And Hollande started out with an electoral, very strong electoral victory, with an approval rating above 60%, and with a strong majority in Parliament, and he crashed and burned. Macron wants to go a lot further than Hollande did, and he doesn't have any of that strength. I mean, let's unpick the election result. Macron got 66% of the vote in the second round, and that sounds like a lot. But what that figure doesn't take into account is a few things. First of all, the turnout was the lowest it's been since 1969. And of the people who did go down to the poll booth and voted, a record number, 12%, posted either a blank ballot or a spoilt ballot. Of those who did vote for him, the most frequent reason given for why they voted for him was just to stop his opponent, Marine Le Pen. So the only mandate he's got from them is to not be a Nazi. And the number who said they voted for him because they support his platform was a very, very small minority, just a few million in a country of more than 60 million. Already, it's just been a few days since the election. He's not in office yet, and thousands of people have protested against him in Paris and other cities. The unions have pledged that they're going to resist the agenda he's going to carry out. And what is that agenda? Because throughout the election campaign, it was a bit of a running joke that he was being very evasive about it. You know, every political cartoon with him in was about saying he'd lost his manifesto, someone had stolen his manifesto, his dog has eaten his manifesto. And that was for a reason, really. I mean, the biggest shift in this election has been the collapse of the main parties. Neither of the two main parties made it to the second round. That's an historic shift. And among the youngest voters, less than 19% in total went to the main parties. And there's a sense that every politician really is hated by someone. And so Macron was really trying not to be associated with any of them. And, you know, to sort of try and offer something to everyone and to be palatable to everyone, he tried to represent absolutely nothing in particular and to be as vague and as vacuous as possible. So when he denied being of the left, he also denied being of the right. And so when people started calling him a centrist, he said, I'm not that either. The word he used was an outsider. And because he was partially successful in posing as an outsider, that's really the reason that he won. But, you know, you can't be nothing forever. Sooner or later, you have to be something. And Macron was only ever a very, very fake outsider. I mean, he was a minister in Hollande's government. He was an economy minister. And one of Hollande's most hated reforms has got his name, the Macron law. Before that, he was a graduate from France's elite education system. Then he was a banker for the Rothschild Bank. Then he was a top civil servant. You know, he's an insider. And his agenda is the establishment's agenda. And in particular, what he wants is to shatter the code of workers' rights in French law, to allow bosses to impose longer working hours in worse conditions for lower pay. He also wants to cut 120,000 public sector jobs. Now, millions of people, particularly millions of working class people, are quite aware of this and hate him for it. And that's why, if you look at the abstentions and the spoiled votes, they particularly come from poorer areas and from the places where left-winger Jean-Luc Mélenchon got big votes in the first round. Now, in France, after a presidential election, there's a parliamentary election. And Macron is in a far, far weaker position going into this than any other president really has been. 61% of people told pollsters that they don't even want him to get a majority in Parliament, which essentially means they want him to be paralysed and not able to do anything. Macron doesn't have a party. He has what he calls a movement, which basically means a list of people who signed up to his website and his online statement. And, you know, he has to get 577 candidates to stand in all the seats around France. He'll announce who they are tomorrow. But, you know, it has been a struggle to get any experienced ministers on board. He said that they're allowed to become one of his MPs without leaving their old party and keeping dual membership. All the old parties have said, no, if you do that, actually you're expelled. The kind of people he's got, I mean, from the right wing, it looks like Christian Estrosi, the regional president of the South East, is going to stand for him. Now, this is a man who, in local government, argued for the French Tories to go into coalition with the Front National. A very unpleasant piece of work. From the centre-left, it's Hollande's Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, told the whole media of the world, really, yesterday that he was about to run for Macron's party. But, of course, Valls has got a lot of baggage, and Macron doesn't even want him. And so there's a bit of desperation for where this new government's going to come from. Among the favourites to be the new Prime Minister after the parliamentary elections is Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF. So an expert in not paying any tax while bullying poor people into accepting austerity. Now, this isn't very appealing, really. And in an attempt to scare people into voting for him, Macron tried to pose himself as an alternative to Le Pen, saying it's me or her. And this went as far as agreeing to a one-on-one TV debate with her, which was entirely unnecessary. I mean, to put it in perspective, in 2002, the president and the candidate for re-election was Jacques Chirac. He was an utterly foul, racist Tory. He was notorious for a speech he once made complaining about, I quote, the noise and the smell of immigrants. And he refused, on principle, to have a debate with a Nazi. Macron didn't. And, you know, by talking up Le Pen and by elevating her into the alternative to him, Macron just really gave her more legitimacy that she was able to use. And in particular, by making it sort of me versus her, he boosted her legitimacy among the people who most hated him. And it's quite worrying, actually, that she got more working class votes than he did. Now, about the Front National and Le Pen, there's two things we have to be very clear on. And first of all, I've used the word fascist, the word Nazi. I'm not using those words lightly, because, you know, there is a narrative that lumps Le Pen together with a broader sort of populism or anti-establishment, nationalist right, whatever, with Donald Trump and UKIP and things. Of course, they're all nasty, and there are some similarities, but the FN is something quite distinct. I mean, it was set up by a hardcore of, well, let's list them, of torturers in France's colonial wars, of collaborators with the Nazi occupation of France, of racist skinhead gangs, and of Holocaust deniers. And they really had the project of recreating fascism and the crimes of Hitler. They're quite isolated and hated for that. And the plan was to use elections to break out of their isolation and to ultimately build a mass party that could do that. And, you know, there have been many tactical shifts of emphasis, been many faction fights and splits, but nothing has ever fundamentally changed that mission of the Front National. What confuses it is that part of its method has always been to try and hide some of its true nature in order to build, in order to win votes. But that's not always easy. I mean, after the first round of the election, Le Pen said she was stepping aside temporarily as leader of the Front National in order to sort of to look more presidential and more safe. It was a very superficial manoeuvre because the Front National was still running her campaign. But to do it, she had to appoint an interim leader, and that meant bringing someone else into the limelight. And the person they found, he didn't actually start the job before having to stand down, Jean-François Jalc, because he was revealed to have a history of denying the Holocaust. He said it was technically impossible for Hitler to have done mass killings with poison gas, and of going to a ceremony celebrating Marshal Pétain, the Nazis' puppet dictator in France. So the lid sometimes comes off. And sometimes the Front National needs to do this deliberately. I mean, if it's going to win some of its voters towards being part of a fascist project, it does sometimes need to reveal fascist ideology to them. And, you know, this is essentially trying to do two quite opposite things at once, to sort of hide its fascist nature in order to get legitimacy and win votes, but also to reveal it in order to draw in and harden up some of its supporters. And that creates a lot of tensions. And in particular, there's one quite major split almost running through the party for several years. On the one side is Marine Le Pen, her deputy Florian Philippot, who have a strategy really of mainly focusing on attacking Muslims and doing it in the name of French republicanism and secularism, and not getting bogged down in forms of bigotry that they think will lose votes, like homophobia and anti-Semitism. On the other hand is her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and her niece, Marion Maréchal Le Pen, who are far more ecumenical in their bigotry and who do, pander more to France, the idea of French tradition and Catholic heritage, and are very homophobic and anti-Semitic. What allows them to control these divisions and contain them is success and forward momentum. And, when they hit setbacks, you sort of see these explode a bit more. And the Front National's gains in this election were actually less than what it had hoped to make. And already over the past few days, these tensions have come to a head. Marine Le Pen has had to face a lot of recriminations. Why didn't you do better? Marion Maréchal Le Pen has even resigned and said she's quitting politics. We'll see how long for. But we have to put these into perspective. When Marine Le Pen and Jean-Marie Le Pen were really relations between them at an absolute low a couple of years ago, and she was expelling him from the party, what happened? Well, his dogs killed and ate her cat. She moved out of the family house. A few weeks later, it mysteriously burnt down. And as he recovered in hospital, he made a point of telling the press, one thing I did save from the flames was my gun. And, despite this rather colourful, shall we say, argument, they were able to put all that behind them for the elections, where he financed a campaign and he spoke to rallies saying she's the new Joan of Arc. There is certainly a bit of a crisis in the Front National at the moment, but there is a problem in the way the Front National is presented in most of the media, mainly in terms of elections. And it sort of flips, really, between apocalyptic panic, oh, Le Pen's going to win, what's that going to mean? And then complacency, oh, she's not won, that's fine, as you were. Well, she was never going to win, and that wasn't the point. She wasn't running in this election to become President of France. What they did was gain 11 million votes. And, they can use that to consolidate and to further their aim of building a mass fascist party. And that's the real threat, and that's something that's often missed in the reporting of it. Now, I would say there's two main things that have allowed the Front National the space, if you like, in which to grow. And one is that the mainstream parties have pumped out consistently racism, nationalism, and particularly Islamophobia, banning the wearing of a hijab in schools and things. Shamefully, sections of the left gone along with the latter. And that, of course, has given the Front National space to say, well, if we need to restrict the Muslims, let's restrict them properly, to go further. The other thing is that there's been a relative, and we shouldn't overstate this, but a relative reluctance to say the Front National is a fascist party and we need to build mass opposition on the streets to stop it organising and to confront it and to cut off its space. As long as those two problems continue, I think whatever setbacks it hits, the Front National isn't going to go away and is going to continue to grow and pose a bigger and bigger threat. Now, there is an alternative to the sort of false choice between the banker and the Nazi. And the reminder of that was Mélenchon and the vote that he got. I mean, he got about a fifth of the vote nationally. And this was at its strongest and most concentrated in the places that were strongholds of the working class. So he came first, for example, in the suburbs of Paris. He came first in Le Havre, which was the port town, became known as the strike capital during the revolt against Hollande's labour law last year. And he did it on the basis of sometimes quite bold policies. He wanted 100% tax on the rich. He wants to repeal the labour law. He wants a 32-hour working week. Now, it's hugely significant that millions of people, and particularly of workers and of young people, didn't just feel let down by the Socialist Party, the Labour-type party of Hollande, but felt radicalised and confident enough to go for something better, rather than just staying at home or going back to the right. We need to be very sober about the limits of what Mélenchon represents. I mean, since he previously ran in 2012, since then he ditched his old organisation, the Left Party and the Left Front that he was a leader of, and created a new sort of patriotic left alliance centred around constitutional reform. It was called La France Insoumise, a sort of unbowed France or a defiant France. And it adapts a strategy that was previously used to an extent by Podemos in Spain, although interestingly they've distanced themselves from it a bit, that's based on the writings of Ernst Leclau and Chantal Mouffe, that basically says, in order to get support, you don't divide society in terms of the left and the right. You don't divide it in terms of one class against another. You do it in terms of the people and an elite that needs to be got rid of. And partly because in a French context, in France the national flag and the national anthem, they're all products of a revolution. There's a big history of left patriotism, and that means Mélenchon's project sort of tapped into that and was a lot more nationalistic than Podemos's had been in Spain. So at his rallies, the flags of left-wing parties were confiscated and the national flag given out, and the crowd encouraged to sing the Marseillaise, the national anthem. Now that's a huge problem. I mean, however progressive you try and make your nationalism, fundamentally nationalism creates two things. It creates a false unity between the rich and the poor, as long as they're from the same country, and a false division between citizens and foreigners. And those two things are each quite dangerous weaknesses for the left. Beyond that, in general, Mélenchon has mobilised huge numbers of people to his rallies, but he doesn't really give them anything to do other than vote for Mélenchon. So it's extremely significant that so many people were willing to break with the Socialist Party. It was a tremendous step, really, in the right direction. But ultimately, they have to go further in that direction than Mélenchon. Now, behind this electoral earthquake and the collapse of the traditional parties is a deep and ongoing crisis for the French ruling class that a whole series of governments have failed to overcome. You can see this looking at the economy. I mean, France was lagging behind other European countries even before the 2009 crisis. Since then, it had a long recession, a very weak recovery. Growth is slowing down again now. Unemployment is at 10% and has been for years around that level. It's 23% among the young. And there's been a whole series of big factories closing down or being moved abroad. Most recently, the Whirlpool factory in Amiens, where you may have seen both Le Pen and Macron turning up opportunistically. Now, the capitalist solution to any such crisis is to make the workers pay, to do austerity and a tax on workers' rights. Now, any political party that does this is going to struggle to keep winning votes from people whose lives it's making worse and attacking. And the main parties in France have had an additional problem on top of that they've struggled to sound credible about the attacks that they're promising because they keep getting defeated by the resistance of the working class. I mean, the whole reason French workers have better protection in many ways than workers in other European countries is that they fought for them. And the French establishment has had sort of hanging over it, really, the challenge of reversing these gains for decades. It's, as Nicolas Sarkozy, the president before Hollande, put it, the challenge is to liquidate once and for all the heritage of May 1968, the huge general strikes then. And the French working class has never quite had that history of militancy beaten out of it by any government. So Chirac was humiliated twice by mass strikes and protests. In 1996, they defeated his pension cuts, and in 2006, they defeated his youth unemployment law. Sarkozy, you could argue, probably won a costly stalemate when he confronted the unions over pensions in 2012. And then last year, the strikes against Hollande's labour law were magnificent, really. And alongside them, there were these assemblies in city squares, the Nuit debout movement, the Night on Our Feet, that really created quite an inspiring sense of renewal after what had been a grim couple of years in France. And alongside that resistance of sort of the organised working class, the French elite is still really haunted by the riots of 2005. And it sort of gets the shivers a little whenever there's protests against police violence. The police are so violent that there are quite a lot of them. And just in the past year, there have really been 3 rounds of protests against police brutality over the killing of Adama Traoré, over the rape with a truncheon of Theo Luhaka, and over the killing of Liu Xiao. Now, attempting to confront this working class and crush its defiance has cost both the main parties very dearly. And first of all, the centre-right became increasingly under Chirac and Sarkozy seen and resented as a party of the rich and the corrupt. And in this election, they tried to overcome that by choosing a really nasty, hard right-wing candidate, François Fillon, who could pander to something quite vicious. I mean, he presented himself to the ruling class as an heir to Margaret Thatcher, someone who'd really teach France to live within its means, as he put it. But to galvanise his supporters, he was also very, very homophobic, or as he put it, very committed to family values, to the point where he marched against gay marriage, holding the same banner as Marion Maréchal Le Pen. The trouble was that he turned out to have used public money to pay his wife and his children to do fake jobs, which is one interpretation of living within a budget and holding up family values, you know, but it's not quite the version people had in mind. And his fall was spectacular. I mean, people may remember when he was picked in the primaries, the news reported it as the next president of France has basically been picked. And, you know, instead of being the next president, in the end he was a laughingstock. Now, for all that, his vote bottomed out at just over 20%. The Socialist Party, the equivalent of the Labour Party, fell far further, fell to under 7%. I mean, it was within a small margin of not getting its campaign costs reimbursed and being bankrupt. Now, it had also had a record of failure and hypocrisy like the Tories had had. But what it also had to do beyond that was go to war with its own support base. I mean, first of all, its repression of Muslims during the state of emergency that was imposed in 2015 has been quite horrific, really. And any sense that this is the default party for anti-racists or the default party for ethnic minorities, it really shot in the foot. And then to pass its labour law, it used draconian powers. Demonstrations were banned. Just this week, 69 people, activists in the new anti-capitalist party and others, were banned from going into central Paris for fear they'd join a demonstration. Suspending debate in Parliament because it knew it would lose. Letting police violence off the leash to terrorise protesting students. You know, some were shot in the face with these rubber grenades they call flashballs. Quite horrifying. And now that party is in a position not much better than its Greek equivalent, PASOK. And just, it's worth pausing to say that's a warning to those people in the British Labour Party who want Jeremy Corbyn to be more right-wing, more pro-austerity, more pro-war, more anti-immigration, in a word, to be more like François Hollande. You know, that way lies disaster for the centre-left. Now, just to finish, in terms of what happens next, so we have Macron is gearing up to build a weak, incoherent and unpopular government from the get-go, and to confront a working class that's still not been unbroken. Can expect explosions, can expect resistance. The big question for France, but really beyond that, I think for Europe and to an extent for the way things are going in the world, is can that resistance turn into something more? Because in the long run, and in a time of crisis, you know, the long run can come very quickly, the kind of stalemate I've described is the kind of situation in which fascism can take root. I mean, in the 1930s, you have to remember, Hitler and Mussolini didn't take power themselves. They were both invited into office by the German and the Italian establishment because they needed the fascist help to do what they themselves had failed to do, to crush and to liquidate the resistance they'd never quite overcome. Now, in France, the increasingly frustrated governments of Chirac, Sarkozy, Hollande, and now by the looks of things Macron, have used authoritarianism and nationalism and racism in a way that really prepares the ground for the Front National. You know, Macron has said he too is going to govern by decree. He's not done any signs of backing off from the police violence in order to push through a new labour law. Now, if that's preparing the ground for fascism, then the task for the French working class and for the left is twofold. First of all, it is to confront and block the fascists, but also it's to pull that ground out from under their feet by going beyond resistance to something that can really challenge the whole system. I think the struggles we've seen it lead show that it does have the potential to do that. I think anyone who saw the strikes last year would feel that, but a lot hangs on whether it can make that a reality.